I watched a video recently by Shin on why one might not want to be a VTuber, and I thought it was really interesting. They describe why they don't want to be a VTuber, and I think it's interesting how much of that argument came down to authenticity, and how, in a certain way, VTubing enabled Shin to be an elevated version of oneself, an exaggerated version of oneself, for which they're able to further hone their abilities. They became a singer, and they became a V-singer by means of their practice and change. They found themselves able to engage in a way that they wouldn't have in the past, limited by a corporeal body. And I think it's interesting that as their personality, their persona began to grow larger and larger, it began to fill and even surpass his corporeal body, they chose to stop being a VTuber. They found it limiting. They found the process of playing the VTuber game, of networking, frustrating and tiresome. They found that they wanted to share more than what VTubers are generally known to do, which I suppose we've seen the very, very edge of that trend in K9 Kuro, where they are a VTuber but also simultaneously a FleshTuber, and the beginning of a trend of VTubers who are sort of graduating full VTubing space in order to become a hybrid tuber. Squeegee also made a really interesting video on mixed reality, where people would be able to plaster their heads onto their physical body so they can interact more physically. Or maybe even there was that one VTubing video where the person was cutting tree branches off of their roof, but they still had the anime head on, and that's really wonderful. One more thing that I want to speak to is that there are uncomfortable groups, there are uncomfortable communities in VTubing where, to those who aren't really excited to be objectified or sexualized, they are often privy to individuals who see them as an anime character or as a creature with a degree of separation beyond human, and feel the right to fantasizing like they would a fictional character. And these particularly H people also pushed Shin out of the space. There was this kind of distance, the degree of separation between the creator and the persona. As it continued to increase, one began to wonder if what was loved was them or this highly curated version of themselves. I have to imagine this exists in other spaces where you become the product, where the creator is the product, and what they present, there happen to be discrepancies between themselves and their persona. They describe it as dysphoria, which I would say dysmorphia instead, by virtue of how I understand dysphoria, but I suppose I understand. There is this dissonance between how people see you and how you see yourself, and whether or not what you're presenting is authentic, or whatever that is you. And transitioning out of the VTuber space, Shin is seeking out the ability to perform themselves more authentically, and bully for them, good for them, happy for them. That being said, I think a lot of the gripes that Shin had were reasons why I enjoy being a VTuber, why I so gravitate toward it. I'm not an incredibly social person, right? I'm not sure how different our confidences are, but I tend to be the kind of individual who often needs to overcompensate for a great lack, a deep gaping hole of social energy. I'm very private. I really only find myself talking to 3 or so people or less a day. And that isn't, and I would include strangers and staff and all that such akin with that. A poor little sad anecdote is I was out with a friend and I got so shy that I gave my friend money so they can buy the thing I needed so I didn't have to talk to the cash register. And VTubing, while that may be a labor to people, especially if they are proficient in talking with other people, VTubing has been a tool for me in order to reconnect with surrounding people. I've met a lot more people in the past year through VTubing than any other medium. And it's because that labor is required, that networking is required. You must, in order to foster yourself in the space around you, sharpen yourself against steel and finding wet stones, so to speak, people who you admire or people who have things that you want. And by virtue of interacting with them, you learn what you need. And it's always really wonderful to make a good friend along the way as well. It's good to make those meaningful relationships that are so rare and few and far between nowadays. So that labor, that burden of being forced to be social and schedule and such, the adulting of VTubing is something that actually pushes me to be a better person. Along with the schedule and the practicum of making things, it used to be very difficult for me to get myself out of bed. And when I started making my 10-minute talks daily a couple of months ago, it gave me purpose in the morning to create things, to get to the PC and start working. And since I've stopped doing daily videos, while I've been able to utilize some of that morning time to work on covers and to work on After Effects edits, I've also found that it's harder for me to stay on task because having one routine thing to sort of push myself toward really became a fixture of my life and was so behavioral that in that gap, I was sort of stumbling on wherever I could find. And it'll take me a second to optimize my ability. But more than anything, with speaking to the objectification of the character and all the like, depending on how it is, if I'm able to have power in that, I kind of like it. The video game that inspired me to start creating on YouTube and on Twitch is Needy Streamer Overload, which, if you are hearing this and you don't know what that means, you should know that everyone else will tell you that it is a red flag. But there's something about apotheosis. There's something about growing into a thing larger than yourself. Something to become an idol, right? And I'm not talking... And I'm only tangentially speaking to the Japanese idol right here. I'm talking a larger-than-life creature. And there's something beautiful about occupying, like a pilot in a mech suit, that kind of space in a place. I greatly admire it. I greatly admire the people who are able to do that, and I understand that that experience is not one that appeals to everyone. It took me a second to realize that, but folks like Shin found that they didn't want to be inaccessible. They wanted, first and foremost, to be a personality that is read and understood. And in some ways, looking at all of this, to be a VTuber allows me to be unfathomable. And that excites me. Ding ding ding, 10 minutes.